Welcome back everyone to our series with NLTI, in which we are discussing the basic concepts of NLSAT, which are going to be quite helpful for your preparation as you're gearing up to give this exam. Today's session is perhaps again one of the most important ones, and it's one that you will not find many easily online available resources on, which is about how to tackle critical reasoning for Part A. So the type of questions they ask in NLSAT, specifically on critical reasoning, tend to be very unique to NLSAT. You will not see these kind of questions anywhere else. So having some insight into what these type of questions are and how to deal with those questions is going to be quite useful for you in this session. I'll give you a brief layout of what I'm going to discuss in this session today. Firstly, I'll discuss with you the different type of questions you can anticipate in this paper. There are a wide range of questions they ask. Among them, some of them come repeatedly year after year. And those specific type of questions that come year after year, I'll discuss more in detail with you. And the rest, I'll just walk you through those questions and tell you how and what type of questions you can expect in this paper. So let's just start with the different type of critical reasoning questions that are asked and how to go about understanding them basically. The first is inference-based questions. These are the most common type of questions, and I'll also discuss this in detail with you in just a short few minutes. These are the questions which basically look like which of the following most accurately describes the author's argument about, let's say, power in the passage above. So these are the kind of questions which will ask you the position of the author and what are the different ways in which the passage has described something that author has talked about. The second is assumption/strengthening and weakening type of arguments, which are that which of the following, if true, would most strengthen the author's argument regarding how we, let's say, treat women in power. Now, these questions are very important because of a few things. One is that this line used here, if true, makes these questions slightly more complex to attempt. And second is that how to know what strengthens the author's argument or what is weakening the author's argument. So that's why these questions can be slightly difficult, and I'll discuss with you again in slightly few minutes how to attempt and what you need to look at in these questions. But nonetheless, these are the kind of questions you will see at least about 5 to 6 questions on an average. In the last 4 editions of NLSAT, they have asked on an average 3 to 4 questions at the very least, which are based on this template, which is which of the following, if true, would either strengthen or weaken the author's argument. Cause and effect analysis, not very frequently recurring, but nonetheless you can see a question or two on this template, which is that based on the information, let's say, provided in the passage, which of the following best explains why artists who have been unable to work this numerically orchestrated hidden mechanism have been left behind. Ignore all this, you can ignore this part. This is just taken randomly from any passage, but the important bits is that how can we explain something, let's say if the passage is talking about some reason due to why an effect has happened, then it may ask you how has the author explained that cause and effect. So such question can look into this template. So it's not so important for you to read this bit, but just to look at how, based on the information in the passage, we can explain why this thing is happening. So the cause will be somewhere provided in the passage, and we are supposed to understand why that is happening. So that has to be inferred from it. So as I said, these are questions which may not come very frequently, but still it's good to have a hang of these questions in our mind. Now, the other one is identifying the author's position. These are the simplest type of questions, and you can again expect about 3 to 4 questions along this template. For example, these require understanding the author's stance or perspective on an issue. For example, which of the following is the author's most likely going to agree with? Or sometimes they might also use word disagree. So this question may come in different formats, but basically they are trying to ask you which of the following statements is author either going to agree with or author is likely going to disagree with. Or the question can also be reframed as which of the following flows from the author's viewpoint. So it may be worded differently, but basically these are the questions which will test you on author's stance or perspective on a certain issue. So if you have understood what the author's main argument in a passage is, you will be able to attempt these kind of questions. The second one is identifying the logical flows. About one question, maybe in a paper, you might see a question along this template. It's not a recurring one, unlike this one, which you will see year after year, and at least about 3-4 questions along this template. This one is not a frequently recurring question. It's mostly asked on a very occasional basis. But nonetheless, the questions like this could be the author is wrong because. So it will test your independent critical reasoning skills. So for these kind of questions, you will not have to look in the passage, but you'll have to look at what the flaw in the author's argument is that they are making. Evaluating the strength of the arguments, which of the following would logically follow from the author's argument. So if the author has made an argument that India is the greatest country in the world, let's say that's the author's argument, then you'll have 4 options and they'll ask you which of the following logically follows from what the author has argued. So you'll have to see which one most proximately relates with the author's argument and most naturally flows from the author's argument. Again, these questions are about 1 to 2 you might expect in the paper, but nothing more than that. Discussing the main idea or theme, these are the questions, staple question you will have about 1 to 2 each every year. So it's not a question which carries a lot of marks, as in like there will not be too many numbers, but you will expect at least 1 to 2 of them each and every year. So it's a question which comes lesser in number, but it does come every year. So that's why these are the kind of questions you also expect. So which of the following accurately and comprehensively communicates the author's main idea? I'll give you a very short trick to attempt these kind of questions. Look at basically either the introduction or the conclusion of the passage, because author will always come up with their main argument either in the introduction or in the conclusion. So if this is a question and if you're slightly unsure which is the right option, then either look at the introduction or the conclusion. You'll find the author's main idea in between among these two, either in the introduction or conclusion. Evaluating analogies and comparisons, we can ignore this for the time being. It's not very important. I think it's only appeared once in the paper in the last 4 years, so it's certainly not a very recurring question. Now let's move on to the more important bit of the session, which is how to discuss, and I'll take 3 very frequently coming or recurring questions in the paper. The first is inference-based questions. After that, I'll discuss with you assumption-based questions, and in the end, I'll discuss with you strengthening and weakening type of questions. So let's start with inference-based questions. Very important, and they come quite in a large chunk in the paper and also carry a lot of weightage marks-wise. Now, what is our objective when we see these kind of questions? We need to see we need to identify what must be true based on the passage, not what might be true. Now, if you're a smart person and if you're preparing for this paper for a while, or if you've just started preparing for it, the easiest trick is written in this first line itself. We need to know what must be true and not what might be true. That's all you need to know for these questions. I'll elaborate on this. Basically, an inference is a logical conclusion drawn from the information provided in the passage, and it is not based on outside knowledge. So if a question comes that which of the following can be inferred from the passage, or which of the following can be inferred from so and so argument made by the author in the passage, then what we need to infer is something which is provided in the passage. Keep that in mind. Sometimes students make this mistake. They think that inference has to be drawn from something which is outside the passage, because you think that author has written XYZ, and if you have to infer something, then that inference has to be an independent assessment. ऐसा नहीं है. Inference has to be taken precisely from what author has provided in the passage. Keep that in mind. That's why this line here is that what must be true and not what might be true. Because if you make an independent assessment of what could be a possible inference, then it falls in this territory and we can never take on that option as the right one. It has to be based on what is provided in the passage. Your inference has to be based on what's given in the passage. The correct inference must be true based on the facts in the passage, even if not explicitly stated. Now, clearly, sometimes the inference is there in the passage, but the way in which it is worded in the option may not be the same. Keep that in mind. The rephrasing can happen. Rephrasing is a different thing, but it can never be substantively. The substance of that information can never be different from what's provided in the passage. So keep that in mind. Whatever the substance is, that will stay the same. However, the form, which is maybe the inference is worded in a certain way in the passage, but how it is worded in the options can be different. So the way of writing it can be different, but the substance of it will always be the same. So when I say that it has to be based on the information provided in the passage, look at the substance of what is provided in the passage. What should our approach when we are looking at these kind of questions? Focus on whatever the facts and evidence is provided in the passage. Eliminate any extreme or speculative options. Any option which uses word like all, always, these kind of words, you can simply chuck them out. These are not important ones. The correct option will be directly supported by the passage, not based on assumptions. Very important. Your option will find itself or will find its backing directly from the information given in the passage. It will not be based on any assumption whatsoever. So for a hypothetical scenario, if you are reading an option and you think it is true, and the reason it is true is because of an assumption you are making in your mind, or if you have to imagine something in your mind, then you can eliminate that option. Because whatever is the right option has to be 100% sourced from the passage. Keep in mind, 100%. Sometimes an option might look true, might appear right. You might think that it is 80% right, plus if 20% you make an assumption. That is a wrong strategy. So I'll just let you see this. Basically what this means is that sometimes an option looks partially true, plus we have a tendency to imagine that if I take this additional 20% in my mind, if I make an assumption, then this option could be true. We need to avoid that. Eliminate any such option which even looks partially true. The option which you have to tick on is one which is entirely derived from the passage. Keep that in mind. It's a very simple advice, but it's very important that students miss out on. If you're in doubt, rephrase the options as what must be true statement and check if any directly follow from the passage. So even if you're confused that you're not able to understand what inference is the right one, just rephrase each and every option as this option has to be true, or this option has to be true because it's coming from the passage. As I stated, avoid choosing options that seem true but are not directly supported by the passage. Basically, if you have to imagine something to justify an option, it is wrong. This line, I'm star marking it because this is single-handedly the most important suggestion. If you face any inference-based question, this is the most, or this is perhaps the simplest trick you have to keep in mind. If you have to imagine something for an option or to justify an option, it is outright a wrong option. The option that is true is one that directly flows from the passage, and anything that seems to be true is not the right option. I hope this clarifies any doubt or confusions you may have. Let's look at an illustration now to put everything we have discussed in practice. So let's say the one part of the passage says that artists who fail to understand the algorithm-driven social media environment are unable to gain visibility and are left behind. The question asks you which of the following can be inferred from the passage. Sometimes the question might also use word validly inferred. Ignore all this, it doesn't really make much difference if it's written validly inferred or accurately inferred. All that is just slight distraction. So now if you look at the first option, all successful artists use social media algorithms effectively. Can we make this inference out from the passage? We perhaps cannot, because the option by itself is extreme, because the passage nowhere talks about all artists. So you can eliminate this option, because as I discussed, generally options which use extreme terminologies like all, always, never are generally, or at least in 90% cases, not the right options. So we can eliminate this option because it is extreme, and also because passage is nowhere using this word that all successful artists use social media algorithms effectively. Second is, an artist's success is dependent solely on their creativity. This one is nowhere being discussed in the passage, and that's why option B is out of scope, because this specific option is not being discussed in this passage. Third is artists who do not understand algorithms struggle to gain recognition. So now you will of course say that artists who fail to understand algorithm-driven social media environment are unable to gain visibility and are left behind. So that's why you can see option C is directly flowing from the passage. There is no ifs and buts. There is nothing you have to assume. There is nothing you have to imagine. The option C is directly coming from what's stated in the passage. Passage states that artists who do not understand algorithm-driven social media environment fail to gain recognition, and option C also says more or less the same thing, that the artists who do not understand algorithms struggle to gain recognition. That's why option C is the right one. Let's move on to the second type of question, which is assumption-based questions. In these, the objective is to understand the unstated premise that connects the argument's premise to the conclusion. In very simple language, let's say an argument is made that India has the most number of people and therefore India is the greatest country in the world. The premise in this argument was India has the most number of people. The conclusion was therefore it is the greatest country in the world. So now you will ask yourself that to reach to that conclusion, an author made a certain premise, which is the author's starting statement. In very simple words, premise means the starting point of an argument. Conclusion is the end point of an argument. In between that premise and conclusion, there must be something in between these two. That is basically an assumption. Assumption is what the author has assumed for their argument to work. Author has not stated it explicitly. That's why these questions are slightly tricky, because author has not stated that thing out there in front of you. You have to gauge what is that assumption that author has made. So basically, it is an unstated premise that connects that argument's premise to the conclusion. So if I said that India has the greatest number of people, therefore India is the greatest country in the world, one of the possible assumptions in this could be that having more number of people is an indicator of success, or having more number of people means India, a country has more manpower to work, it has more labor force. So maybe these are the reasons why author has said that India is the greatest country in the world. There can be many assumptions behind an argument, depending on how broad the conclusion is, but we have to gauge what are the possible assumptions that the author has made for an argument to work. How to know what is an assumption? That's where you use the why test. So if I were to say that why is India the greatest country in the world, then maybe one of the reasons I would say is that because if you have more number of people, then you have more people to work in industries and in perhaps your economy. So maybe it's the greatest country in the world. Maybe one reason could be that if you have more number of people, it is an indication of having more cultures, more languages, more traditions in the country. So maybe that thing makes India the greatest country. So anytime you want to dig out what is an assumption, use the why test. Ask yourself why that conclusion is true. Why is this conclusion being arrived at by the author based on the premise? So why does the author believe in the conclusion? If you ask this question to yourself, you'll automatically come up with something, and that is one of the assumptions that author has made. Apply the negation test. What it means is that if negating the option destroys the argument, that is the correct assumption. Basically, assumption is like a engine, or I will call it like perhaps a connecting factor between premise and conclusion. So let's draw it out. We have a premise and we have a conclusion. To reach from premise to conclusion, author needs an assumption. So assumption is somewhere in between. And now to reach to this point, we have this assumption. If the question, let's say, asks you identify the correct assumption in this argument, or which of the following is been assumed by the author in the following argument, and if you have 4 options A, B, C, D, to identify the correct assumption, if this assumption is taken out, let's say this assumption exists right now, so this argument exists. This whole thing exists because of this assumption, because it connects, it holds together the premise and conclusion. If I take it out, then this will fall. So to identify a correct assumption, always use the negation test, which means if I were to take out this assumption, how does it affect the argument? How does it affect the premise and conclusion? If your conclusion falls by removing that assumption, then that means that was the right assumption in that argument. So to identify an assumption, you need to look at, if I were to take this out, then will this argument still stand? If it stands, then that probably is not the right assumption that you have identified. But if it does not stand, then it is the right assumption, because without that assumption, this argument could not have worked. So that's why premise or conclusion ke beech mein you have an assumption. To put it more simply for you, we need this assumption for that argument to work. For us to reach from P to C, if this assumption were not here, we would not have reached here. So that's why assumption is like a tool which is holding these things together. So if any question asks you to identify an assumption, use the strategy of negation test. Let's take an example now. For example, the government should provide financial support to folk artists as they suffered economic losses during the pandemic. What is the assumption underlying this argument? So, of course, the premise of this argument first is the government should provide financial support to folk artists. Actually, this is the conclusion because it asks you what government should do. And the premise is that because they have suffered economic losses. So this is our premise. Premise is where we start from. Basically that because these people have suffered economic losses, therefore the government should provide financial support. So we have a premise, we have a conclusion. We need to find out in between these two what is connecting them together. So what is that assumption here? First option, the government is responsible for the welfare of artists. Why should a government provide financial support to artists if they have suffered economic losses? What is the reason? Why should a government be responsible? So, as I said, the way to identify is that, just a moment, we have to identify the unstated premise that connects the author's premise to the conclusion. And the why test which we used here says that why does the author believe this conclusion? So why does the author believe this conclusion? Why should the government provide financial support to the artist? If we were to take option A, that the government is responsible for the welfare of artists, then that can be a reasonable assumption, because yes, the only way we can justify that the government is responsible for the welfare of artists is because through that responsibility, because of which they are responsible for welfare of artists, we justify that they should provide financial support to them. If you look at option B and C, which is folk artists prefer government support over private funding, then this option is not really an assumption, because whatever folk artists prefer is not so important. The option asks us, or the question asks us to justify why government believes that they should provide financial support. Option does not ask us why folk artists or what they prefer. So that's why this option becomes the wrong one. Similarly, artists do not know how to market their work. This argument is probably, or this option is probably out of the scope because it just does not discuss any assumption. So that's why option A is the right one, because it explains to us why the government is responsible. So that's why you can, whichever test you want to use, if you use the why test, which asks why does the author believe this conclusion, then option A responds to that, and option A tells us why government is responsible, because they are the ones who have to look out for the welfare of the artist. So that's how you deal with the assumption-based questions. The next we have, and the last one is probably one which also confuses the students the most, is strengthen, weakening type of questions. Now, if you've understood assumption, which we just discussed right now, you'll also be able to understand them because these are also equally easy. Our objective in this is to add new information to either support or undermine the argument. These are the kind of questions in which you will be provided new information in the option. So if you're ever surprised by these questions, then let me just simplify this for you. In all these type of questions, you will be provided new information in the passage or new information in the options. So for example, if the question, let's say, just take the illustration right away. The argument is the Indian government policy of free legal aid has successfully reduced inequality in access to justice. Then which of the options strengthens this? So now all these four options are not taken from the passage. They are hypothetical options. The reason why that is because in these kind of options, oftentimes they use the word which of the option if true. Likha hota hai, you must have seen this in many questions. The reason they say if true is because we have to assume these four options are true, and then we have to see which of them strengthens or weakens. So do not get confused. If you look at the four options and think that none of them are in the passage, how do I attempt the right one? The options are designed to be hypothetical, and that's why the word if true is used, okay? So we need to understand that if we add new information, that new information is often added by the options itself, then which of those options will either support or undermine the author's argument? Every argument is built on an underlying assumption. We just saw that here, that if the argument is that government should provide financial support to folk artists because they suffered during pandemic losses, it had an underlying assumption, and that underlying assumption was that government is responsible for their welfare. So every question has to have an underlying assumption. Our task in these questions is to either see how that is being strengthened by providing additional support to that assumption. Those are the strengthening type of questions. And if it's a weakening type of question, then we look at the argument, which of these options are attacking that assumption. Basically, when you're attempting these questions, you have to know few things. One, argument. What is the argument that you're even being asked to either assess if it's being weakened or strengthened? Usually you will be provided in the question itself. For example, here argument is already given to you, and let's say the question will ask which of the following strengthens the argument. Argument is here. So usually it's given in the question. If it's not given in the question will give you a brief, crisp summary of it, and then you can go back to the passage and see what the argument is. But our first task is to understand what the argument is. So be very clear when these questions come to understand what the argument is. Once you understand the argument, identify the assumption. You can ignore the word core for the time being. I do not wish to confuse you by using the word argument and core argument. Let's just use the word argument here. So just remove this word for the time being. Identify the assumption on which the argument is based. That's our second task. Once we know the argument, then we need to know what the assumption is on which that argument is based. For strengthened questions, bridge the gap between the premise and the conclusion, or add new evidence that directly supports the argument. So when you look at strengthening questions, all we need to do is assess how we can bridge the gap between premise and conclusion by adding new evidence which directly supports the argument's logic. So anything which strengthens that assumption that is binding the premise and conclusion will be a right option. And in weakening questions, anything which introduces any alternate cause or evidence that attacks the core assumption of the argument. Any new information which explains or which attacks the assumption in that argument will be the right option. Let's put it into practice, okay? Because now it might seem slightly confusing to you. Understand the argument first, that Indian government's policy of free legal aid has successfully reduced inequality in access to justice. Which of the following strengthens the argument? The number of marginalized individuals filing the cases increased after free legal aid. The reason, so if you look at this argument, it says the Indian government policy of free legal aid has successfully reduced the inequality in access to justice. Premise यहाँ पे है कि Indian government policy of free legal aid, ठीक है? This is our premise. Conclusion is has successfully reduced the inequality. This is our conclusion, okay? In between these two, we have to have an assumption, which is that the government has introduced the policy of free legal aid, and therefore the inequality has reduced or has successfully reduced the inequality in access to free justice. Why has that happened? One of the ways you can explain that is that the number of people who are marginalized have increased in the number who are filing cases for free legal aid. So this is one of the ways in which we are strengthening the assumption that by introducing this policy of free legal aid, there is a reduction in inequality in access to justice. How can we explain this? Option A explains it by saying that there are more number of people who are filing cases now. If there are more number of people filing cases, it explains or it strengthens the assumption that there are more people or more marginalized people who are able to access justice. Similarly, if you look at option B, most lawyers refuse to represent poor clients despite free legal aid. This one weakens it because our conclusion is inequality is reduced in access to justice. That's our conclusion, okay? If you look at option B, it says that lawyers are refusing to represent poor clients despite free legal aid. If lawyers say no to the clients and say, I'll not represent you, then it automatically weakens the conclusion, which is that access to justice is being reduced, or that inequality in access to justice is being reduced. So that's how we're looking at it. We're basically seeing all these are one way or another way of putting assumptions. The first assumption is strengthening our conclusion. This assumption weakens our conclusion. So that's why it weakens and this one strengthens. That's how we need to look at it. So let me give you a very quick last tip on this. If the option, all of these options are assumptions, by the way, all of them are trying to assume something to make that argument work. If the assumption strengthens your conclusion, it successfully will strengthen it. So if an option asks you which of the following strengthens the argument, look at whether or not that argument or whether or not that option strengthens our conclusion. And for weakens, we'll look at whether or not that option weakens our assumption. If it does, then that's the right one. So that's the tip and trick you need to use to attempt these kind of questions. Keep in mind, that's why I discussed assumption type questions first and then these type of questions, because it's all an interplay of assumption and conclusion and how they interact with each other. I hope this session was helpful. It might have been slightly more confusing. You can leave a comment in the comment box if in case you do not understand anything. Thank you all for watching this session, and I hope that it truly clarified your doubts surrounding critical reasoning. We'll be back with more sessions. Thank you all once again.